that you can't separate the dumb and intelligent parts of the network. I mean, my guess it would be the likes of Juniper, Cisco, maybe Parallel Wireless. They're seeming, American companies who have a lot to gain out of, the American way is you can't separate these two segments.
Well, American companies do say that, but that's also Ericsson's position, or it's the position of their head of Europe. That's blurring. So, and I know this.
Again, I'd say that's quite convenience.
Yeah, but it's also very convenient that Scott Petty says you can. It's also very convenient that operators, that don't want to remove Huawei because they don't want the hassle of doing it. They don't want the cost. They don't want the 2-year delay. It's also very convenient for them to say.
It's hard to know who's purely.
So it's objective, but there's not a clear-cut argument.
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. This may or may not be the last one we do remotely because we're potentially allowed back into the office next week, but we're going to have to see how the logistics play out. It's a bit more manageable, the temperature today, so that's all good. Right, we've got to get a move on because Ian's got some parenting to do after this. So I'm going to say that we're going to get the inevitable Huawei out of the way first up this time. No one questions that we have to talk about them every week. That's part of our job. In fact, we get sacked if we don't talk about them every week. So this week, we're just going to get out of the way. There's been Ian and I have both written things about them in the UK, and there's always the usual steady drip of news to do with them. Then we're going to go on to broadband, specifically broadband investment. Jamie's been looking at that this week. And then finally, we're going to have a look at this ad boycott that Facebook and other social media companies have had. We touched on it last week, but it's developed a fair bit since then. So we'll talk about that. And just to remind you that if you are watching this on the site or on YouTube or on Facebook, you can also listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and countless other podcasting platforms. Okay, so Ian, you and I both wrote both. Forgotten how to speak. both wrote speculative things about Huawei's future in the UK. I better shut up so that I can untangle my tongue. So I'm going to hand over to you first.
Yeah, I mean, there's not been any kind of great dramatic development as regards Huawei, I wouldn't say, but there's just this sort of gathering sort of voice against them, combined with, which is more your kind of angle, I think, Scott, some political developments in the background to do with what's happening in Hong Kong. And I wrote about it because I just think, I mean, it's hard for us to take a position on whether they should be excluded from the UK. I'm not sure that's what we necessarily want to do, but I think it's becoming a lot harder for the government to not exclude them. I think that was the sort of basic sort of thing that I was saying. There's this. It's not been a particularly good news week for them in some ways. There's been a couple of big opinion pieces coming out of fairly significant news outlets. I saw Bloomberg did a really, really good sort of investigative story about them in Canada and the whole kind of Nortel entanglement going back a few years, which has just sort of brought up all these questions about not necessarily the security side of things, but them just being a kind of general bad actor, I think, is the expression that gets used. And there's never really been a kind of smoking gun. They've never really been sort of caught in the act. But there's just this sort of gathering list of things that they're seen to have done that kind of counts against them, from, intellectual property infringements to, getting a lot of state funding and then going and dumping products to sort of drive Western rivals out of business, to the security thing, the allegations of, selling products in Iran in breach of trade sanctions and then lying about it afterwards, and then there's always this kind of suggestion that they have, very, very close links to the Chinese government, which they've constantly denied. But the one thing they can't deny is that they're Chinese. And unfortunately, if you're Chinese, under Chinese law, that basically means you are, you're basically subject to the Chinese government. Whatever they say, you have to kind of do. So it puts them in a very difficult position. And what's happening politically, I just don't think helps at all right now. We've seen a much more aggressive China in the last few weeks during the whole coronavirus pandemic, I think, than arguably in my lifetime, actually. I think you look at what's going on in the Indian border and the South China Sea, and then Hong Kong this week, these sort of dramatic scenes from...
Well, exactly. That was the main sort of pretext for my piece. where I basically said I just drew a direct line between the Hong Kong situation and Huawei's fortunes in the UK, which you wouldn't necessarily do, because what the hell has Huawei got to do with politics in Hong Kong? But my reasoning was that Hong Kong obviously is a former US colony, or we sort of leased it off China for 100 years, which is a weird thing. Gave it back to them a few decades ago. And there were various sort of solemn oaths and declarations and statements that were designed to protect the residents of Hong Kong and create what the Chinese call a one country, two systems setup. Now, in hindsight, China was always going to look to chip away at that one country, two systems setup. So that's not at all surprising, but that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be pushback every time it overtly does so. And that's taken the form of this new law that the people of Hong Kong have been demonstrating against for months, possibly even years. That's basically going to give China much more legal jurisdiction over Hong Kong, including extraditing troublesome Hong Kong residents to mainland China to then be locked in a cage for the rest of their lives, presumably. And Hong Kong residents are understandably alarmed by this. And anyway, getting it back to the point of my story, the reason that's a big deal is then the UK did what I think is the decent thing, which has extended a sort of path to citizenship for about half the residents, about 3 million of them, who presumably have some kind of direct ties to some form of UK citizenship. And basically said, in theory, 3 million of you could get on a plane tomorrow, come over to the UK, and we'll let you live here. And this has upset the Chinese government, and they did their usual response of saying, "Look, it's none of your business, so butt out."
Yeah, they sort of said they block it, didn't they?
Yeah, and then they said they block it, and then they started talking non-specifically about retaliations and countermeasures, and basically coming out with some quite threatening vibes. And so that's why I reckon that has direct bearing on the Huawei situation, because, well, I mean, this is another Huawei story this week. Boris Johnson wasn't talking about it. He was talking about this new deal where a bunch of state spending to sort of help the country bounce back from the lockdown and the recession it caused. He got asked a question about Huawei and Hong Kong. And initially he said, I'm not going to indulge in Sinophobia, which I thought was a little bit weird because no one was suggesting he was. They were just asking about a very specific thing.
And no one uses that expression anymore either.
No. Well, there's so many other things that we're supposedly phobic about. But anyway, don't get me started, mate. But then he did basically refer to Huawei as a, quote, hostile state vendor.
Yeah.
So, I mean, actually, there's two ways in which you could look at those three words in a sort of eats, shoots and leaves sort of way. It could be a hostile, state vendor, or it could be a hostile state, vendor. Anyway, I think it was the latter. Or it could just be three separate words. But
there wasn't any pausing between it, was there? He just kind of came out with it as a phrase.
Yes.
So,
So go on, Jamie.
I mean, the statements, I didn't hear it live, but I didn't necessarily take it as direct reference to Huawei. Because he literally said something about Huawei, and then afterwards he said, we're obviously going to protect our borders and our networks from hostile state vendors. Now, it depends on which side of the coin you are, that, whether you read into that as direct reference to Huawei. But I don't know. When I first read it, I just thought it was a political statement, just saying, we got to protect ourselves from hostile enemies. Not it's like talking about France, and then the next sentence saying we're obviously going to protect our borders from people who could launch sea assaults on us.
Well, let's argue the toss over it here, because I did transcribe it from the live video. And he wrote, on Huawei and other matters, the position is very simple. I'm not going to get drawn into Sinophobia because I'm not a Sinophobe. On the other hand, I do want to see our critical national infrastructure properly protected from hostile state vendors. So we need to strike that balance, and that's what we'll do. Now, to me, Jamie, that is very much leading on to the Huawei and other matters, position. I agree with you. He's not explicitly saying Huawei is a hostile state vendor, but I don't find it at all difficult in that context to say that he's talking about hostile state vendors when specifically addressing the Huawei situation. Do you see what I mean?
Yes and no. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I didn't read into it. I mean, it again, this, eat, shoots and leaves. It's dependent on who actually reads the statement to you is how it comes across and how you emphasize certain points. But I'm just saying, like, the first time I read it, I was like, I don't know. I don't necessarily would have taken that away. But yeah, I think eat, shoots and leaves is a.
It could be interpreted either way. That's fair enough. And anyway, just to finish off my sort of angle on my thing. I basically, talked about China threatening the UK over Hong Kong and just concluded that if Boris Johnson's already using language like that, whether or not it was just an unfortunate phraseology, which if he could say it again, he would have used the more standard high-risk vendor terminology, or whether he was very deliberately escalating the vocabulary, then to be directly threatened by China is not going to make him feel more sort of accommodating towards its most prominent company in this country.
Well, there's a breakdown in relations, isn't there? Basically, and
it does seem to be.
One of the reasons for not banning Huawei, obviously, I think a big reason for not banning Huawei is that we don't want to, especially sort of post EU and everything, while we're trying to strike trade agreements and stay in the good books of China and the US, is we don't necessarily want to pick a side. We don't want to upset,
totally.
big nations and their big companies, and banning Huawei would risk some kind of retaliation, perhaps, or certainly risk upsetting China and jeopardizing the future relationship with them. If that relationship's already kind of bombed because of what's happening in Hong Kong, then it sort of takes away one of the reasons for doing something. So, but I just think, look, if Huawei was, if it wasn't so bloody brilliant at what it does, and everybody agrees that its technology is among the best in the world, if it didn't have that position, and if it wasn't such a hassle to get rid of it in the first place, if it didn't have that kind of fairly entrenched position in the UK, I think it would probably already have been banned. Yeah, it's just.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there, which is the actual reason it hasn't. Well, I mean, obviously, I think there's some sort of political implications to it, but my thing is, for the biggest reason why it hasn't been banned is, number one, technology companies want to make technology decisions based on technology rationale, and Huawei's products are very, very good, if not the best, depending on the market segment. And a number of CTOs have told me that the other reason is, when you actually have a look at the customization of the products, it's better, but also the care you get and the account management from Huawei staff afterwards is just second to none in the world. But then you've also got to think, like you were leading on to it there, I think, or past reference to it, about the rip and replace, about the 4G underlying network. You need backwards in what's it called?
Compatibility.
Compatibility, that's the word. So I think, although there are political elements to this, I would go as far to say that the technological reasons for keeping Huawei are much more important, because it would set how many years back would it set UK telcos if they had to continue without Huawei. I mean, we just saw today that Vodafone has launched a standalone 5G network in Coventry University. There's a single figures number of telcos around the world that have actually done that. So you take Huawei out of the equation, how many years back does that set UK telecoms networks?
Well, I think Scott Petty tried to put like a couple of years on it, didn't he? That was that thing we were chatting about that's a recurring theme.
Nick Reed said 2 years across Europe as a whole, if we had to do it.
Well, maybe that was it, yeah.
With this cost.
But Vodafone's quite vocal on the matter, isn't it?
I just feel that the tide is turning, even technologically to some extent. I mean, it's always a balance. Is you want to, in a way, you don't want to get rid of them because they're so good, and because the market already has a limited number of competitors. It would cause disruption. It would cause hassle for the operators. On the other hand, there's this sort of charge sheet against them, which is getting longer by the day. And relations, meanwhile, are deteriorating with China, and people are raising that as a concern more and more now about whether we really want Chinese companies. So it's sort of it's a balance, and I just sense that things are slightly tilting towards the concerns about actually having a company like that involved, and away from the technological side. And on the technological side, some of the other things we're seeing happening, I mean, we talked about this a lot of time on the podcast, but the emergence of new rivals, and I'm not even necessarily talking about Open RAN, which is the one that always gets thrown up, but companies like Samsung, and I mean, NEC is obviously doing quite a lot of Open RAN stuff, but there are other sort of options coming along that would allow operators to potentially find alternatives. And you've even heard some of the CEOs kind of allude to it. I think what they don't want to see happen is some kind of edict to get rid of Huawei in a really short amount of time. That's the real worry. I mean, they've done swaps before. It's not like, and this notion that you should never ever be able to do a swap's quite a worrying one anyway, because what does that say? It says the market's always going to be dominated by those three companies. I mean, if we bring Open RAN in, you have to do a swap at first. You can't, the stuff that's there isn't compatible with Open RAN. So even that would mean swapping stuff out. So, they just don't want to have to do it quickly. They want to be given the time if they need to do it. And, some of the other arguments as well, I mean, there's stuff about one thing the operators thought they could do to mitigate some of the security concerns, I think, was to have this demarcation between the core and the radio, which you've always talked about. But even that sort of now increasingly seems to be up for debate. I mean, you've got some of the big vendors saying they don't think that makes sense in a 5G world because the lines are blurring. So that argument the operators have come out with, I think, is potentially a bit tenuous. And I mean, I can't really comment on that. We don't know the technology enough to know whether someone in the radio really does expose you to a security risk. You'd have to go and talk to some engineer who's well in the thick of it, and you're going to hear different things depending on what suits different people. But it's
my skepticism of what you said there is who has actually told you or said it that you can't have what was I going with this? That you can't separate the dumb and intelligent parts of the network. I mean, my guess it would be the likes of Juniper, Cisco, maybe Parallel Wireless. They're seeming, American companies who have a lot to gain out of, the American way is you can't separate these two segments.
Well, American companies do say that, but that's also Ericsson's position, or it's the position of their head of Europe. That's blurring. So, and I know this.
I'd say that's quite convenient.
Yeah, but it's also very convenient that Scott Petty says you can. It's also very convenient that operators, that don't want to remove Huawei because they don't want the hassle of doing it. They don't want the cost. They don't want the 2-year delay. That's also very convenient for them to say.
Yeah, it's hard to know who's purely objective.
It's objective, but there's not a clear-cut argument. It's not like someone's shooting something down and saying this is absolutely ridiculous what he's suggesting there. You see both stories floating around, and we're sort of just left to sort of try and figure something out based on it. And I suspect it's something in the middle, as a lot of these things tend to be. It's probably some degree of security by keeping it out of the out of the core. Who knows in future?
But certainly not enough to keep the Yanks
software in the radio access network. So. But I sense that and other things going on, that things are kind of tilting towards. I'd be very, very surprised if Huawei's position, if it's able to sort of keep its position in the UK market, given what's going on. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I just think, the kind of
we're just commentators. In fact,
the winds of change are sort of blowing, and I just feel its days are numbered, unfortunately, for Huawei.
Well, the thing I would, I mean. Yes, I do agree with that. And to be perfectly honest, if I was to predict an outcome, I would probably say that high-risk vendors are going to be asked to be removed from the network within a 5-year timeline. So then the question is, can Huawei remove the designation of high-risk vendor within that 5-year period? But on the idea of can it be separated? I'm slightly inclined to believe some of these telcos because because it's a critical communications and it's national infrastructure. they're going to have some sort of legislation or regulation which dictates they have to implement the best technology and make it secure. So they're going to do their due diligence to make sure that they're not putting any erroneous components into the network. If they put suspect technology in there, they're opening themselves up to lawsuits. They're opening them up to financial penalties. They'll get sacked. There are. It's not simply a case of I'm picking this because it's the best. They do have their requirements on them, and I can't think of the right words. There'll be some sort of bureaucratic requirements and legal requirement to make sure this is all safe. Otherwise, there'd be significant penalties down the road. I agree with you. What's the world going to look like, or the UK market going to look like in 5 years' time? I suspect telcos will be told to remove all high-risk vendors from the network. And then you've got to ask, what can Huawei do about that? Can it do anything about not being Chinese? Does it re-domicile? Does it create a separate legal entity which is headquartered in London, let's say, where that licenses its technology from Huawei to create a international Huawei company, but isn't anything to do, and complete legal separation from the Huawei corporation in Shenzhen? Would that... Technically, it's still a Huawei company, and profit might go back there. But technically, that might answer the question or ease the concerns of some people if it's a complete legal separate entity listed in London. I don't know. My guess is it would.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I think it's a perfectly sensible suggestion, and probably in a technical sense quite workable. I think what you sometimes get with political stuff is momentum. Things are sort of unstoppable. Famously, people talk about, if you ever watch that documentary about the first, 90 days building up to the First World War, there was just so much momentum towards war that it was almost impossible not to do it. And, further to what Ian was saying, I just get the impression that the momentum is going against Huawei so much that even if they made a perfectly sensible and substantial concession like Jamie just suggested, everyone will go, no, we've made our mind up, it's done. And regarding they can't help being Chinese, because I've written that, and then Boris Johnson talking about Sinophobia. This is obviously nothing to do with the country or their ethnicity or the culture or anything like that. It's just to do with the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party. And it is getting more belligerent. And I can't see that changing. I mean, my real worry, and I think we might have chatted about this offline, is as more and more actions get taken against it, it becomes self-reinforcing. So like we've got aggro on the Indian border, and now India is banning Chinese apps left, right, and centre. We've got aggro in Hong Kong, which is probably going to lead to a breakdown in relations between us and China. We've got the US thing going on. If Trump gets voted back in November, that's just going to ramp up even more. And the only downside is, even if you agree that China needs to be kept in check because it's getting increasingly ambitious and belligerent, if you overdo it and make it a cornered tiger, then that's when people like Xi Jinping, who I gather is very autocratic. It's not like he's even got an inner circle around him. It's just Xi on his own. It's just going to start going, well, then what have I got to lose? I might as well start really lashing out at people. So anyway, that's a bit of a tangent from the Huawei thing. But the common thread is that what the Chinese Communist Party does, I think, is going to increasingly affect the fortunes of Huawei in the UK. Were you going to say something, Ian?
If I was, I've forgotten it now. I think I was probably going to make a point on the re-domiciling, because it was interesting they had that move. I can't even remember when it was now, but
it was announced months ago, wasn't it?
The cloning thing, and maybe there was something in that to do with this sort of thought that they could clone the business and then flog it to a US company, a Western company. And it's interesting you mentioning re-domiciling now. Maybe there was something in that suggestion that they thought that there could be a sort of shell company set up somewhere, maybe, that then acquired that and and got going as basically a US business with its headquarters in New York or wherever. But because it was quite a curious move for them to make, and then it never really seemed to go anywhere.
Well, I think it was one of his CNN coffee
interviews.
with Ren.
That's right. Coffee with Ren. Yeah.
Yeah, and he came up with the idea on that. Yeah.
But it's. I mean, it'd just be a difficult thing to do to, as you say, I think completely convince someone that the new company that got set up didn't have any links back to the Chinese government. That would always kind of dog it, and you'd have to make sure that most of its staff were not Chinese, and that it'd just be, I don't know.
Then you would be open to accusations of xenophobia, wouldn't you?
Well, you would, exactly. So it'd be such a hard thing to do, but. I don't know how they get around that issue, though. To be honest with you, the fact they are Chinese is what condemns them, really.
Yeah, it seems it, and as we've been saying on the pod and in our writing for months, probably years. In fact, I think I remember chatting about this when we were podding in the old studio. What can Huawei do? It's guilty of being a certain nationality. So I do have some sympathy for their position, while making absolutely no comment one way or the other as to how beholden to its government it is. One last thought before we move on to the next topic. Something you said earlier, Ian, I thought was bringing up. I think people forget that a big job of being a journalist is that we've got all sorts of incoming messages coming from various sides, some neutral, some with an agenda. And a big part of our job isn't necessarily the writing. It's before the writing. We have to weigh up all those various things. Perhaps not necessarily pick one, but sort of distill the essence of all those things, and then try and convey what we think is the truth at that particular moment in our writing. And I think people sometimes underestimate that, perhaps because a lot of journalists have become partisan and activist. But I know all three of us take a pride in just saying, okay, this is what's going on at the moment. Let's have a read around. Let's get some context. Let's get some multiple sources. And let's see what seems to be the truth at this particular moment. And the Huawei thing's a classic example of that. We'll have people whispering in our ear, some hostile to Huawei, some allies of Huawei, some people with a geopolitical agenda, some people with just some chip on their shoulder or whatever. And you can look in the comment sections of Telecoms.com articles about Huawei if you doubt it. I mean, the one I wrote about Hong Kong is just crazy, isn't it? I don't know if it's even worth reading out one. It just absolutely cracked me up.
You should read it out, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So a bloke called Ladakh China, I say a bloke, could have been a woman, says, and so this is very broken English with lots of exclamation marks in it. They say, China #1, foreigners is dirt on China boot. India also dirt. Lick our boots. China have 100% human rights and we stop virus. Very good. And it just goes on like this. And it's just, I just couldn't, I was asking Wei just to give me some cultural insight. Is this person just taking the piss or is it legit? And Wei thought that it probably was legit, if maybe a bit on the trolling side. But yeah, you should, anyone listening to this, just check out my sort of Hong Kong Huawei story and check out the comments, because there's some crazy stuff going on in there at the moment. Anyway, it's all good fun. So, next topic, broadband investment. Jamie, you wrote about that, so I will not steal your thunder and I'll let you just get straight into it.
So it's this is primarily about COVID and the reaction from various governments. We're focusing on the US and the UK here to sort of combat the recession and get the economy moving again. And both of them have taken inspiration from sort of 1930s America and the sort of the FDR presidency, who sort of championed the sort of the New Deal, which was effectively a series of creating a series of alphabet agencies to build national infrastructure, get people back into the work, and have knock-on effects in various different sort of supporting industries. It's called Keynesian economics. So, you build a hospital, you employ 300 people from the construction company. That construction company buys wood. The timber mill employs another 300 people, and on and on and on and on and on. So that the the proviso is that the government has to be prepared to get into a considerable amount of debt and lower taxes for this sort of theory to play out properly. So what you've seen in the UK and the US is some really significant investments in infrastructure projects. Now, I can't remember exactly how much the figure was in the UK, but in the US, they're talking about $1.5 trillion investment. A lot of it's in roads, a lot of it's in hospitals and schools in both in the US and the UK. But I thought the most interesting element of both of them was the reference to broadband, because obviously there's a big push to get full fibre out everywhere and also connect the unconnected. Now, fibre wasn't mentioned, or broadband wasn't mentioned in the slightest by Bojo. Not a single reference or money put aside, a pocket or anything. There was some sort of clauses which would say, you have to, like this school, a certain amount of the money has to be put into to sort of like remote learning and blah, 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 all that. But there was no actual concrete reference to broadband. Whereas on the other side of the Atlantic, you've got the Democrats passed this bill through, I think it's called the Moving Forward Act or something like that, through the first house, and it's now going to get past the Senate, which would put $100 billion in the hands of the FCC and private industry to roll out broadband across the country. It's another big infrastructure project, but also to support connectivity. And it's paying attention to an industry which often gets overlooked, or a subsector of the industry which often gets overlooked, and that is broadband. And we just take for granted that broadband's going to happen here in the UK, primarily because we've got a good copper network. I mean, it's an aging asset with open reaches crying to sweat. But it is actually a good broadband network. I just think it's the UK, first of all, aren't following up on their promise from a couple of years ago. Big, bold promise in New Deal, but haven't actually followed up Bojo's claim that he was going to connect the country with full fibre by 2025. Whereas the Democrats in the US are making a really aggressive push to the broadband network, which has really never got much attention in the US. So it's just, I thought it was quite two very interesting approaches to re-stimulating the economy, with broadband at the centre and not at the centre. But it'd be interesting to see how that money is actually distributed in the UK and whether this bill actually even gets to the desk of the president in the US.
Yeah, well, the aftermath of this unique event, which was the coronavirus pandemic and the subsequent lockdown and the consequent stalling of economies, you look at some of those charts of the drop-off of GDP and employment and that sort of thing, and it's completely unprecedented. You look at financial crashes, you look at other disasters, you look at, I don't know, bubbles bursting, 9/11, whatever. There's nothing like this drop-off. But that's because we've never, certainly as long as I've been alive, and certainly as long as I think, my parents and grandparents have been alive, I've had a time where countries just gone, right, we've got to stop working for months. So it's completely unprecedented. And as Jamie's saying, that sets the scene for this Keynesian supply side economics, where the logic is a massive investment by the state at the start produces this so-called multiplier effect in the long term, whereby you build that hospital and the people are employed in it, but then also everyone's healthier, so they can go hi-ho off to work with a spring in their step. And there are all these sort of knock-on benefits, which on paper, the multiplier effect always seems fairly compelling. But then you look at, it's happened to, like, Gordon Brown was a big fan of the multiplier effect. Then you look at when we have had massive increases in public spending and whether there was a multiplier effect. And usually there hasn't been for some reason. And it's presumably incredibly complicated why. But then, going off that general economics tangent, the broadband one, sorry, were you going to say something?
What is worth noting is that it does work. It does work when it's implemented wholeheartedly and sensibly. You look at the majority of investments which have been made in this sort of multiplier effect in the last couple of decades, and they've been invested in areas which aren't necessarily the best for the economy, if that makes sense. So you invest in a hospital because it's good PR and it's a good political move, but you don't. But it's not necessarily the best for inspiring additional industries and long-term benefits. You build roads because it improves the travel infrastructure, it gets people to work further, it improves the logistics industry, and it employs a lot of people and a lot of raw materials. Because I studied this quite a lot in years gone. And if you actually have a look at the two countries which were the quickest to recover from the Great Depression in the 1930s, and it's not the US, because although FDR's strategies did look at this sort of multiplier effect and sort of like compound catalysts throughout different parts of the industry, they didn't invest in it wholeheartedly because of political resistance. The two countries which got out of the Depression and recession the fastest were Germany and Sweden. Now, Germany doubled down on its army.
Be careful what you're going to recommend here, Jamie.
Yeah, it doubled down on investments, but actually forced companies who were claiming this state benefits to spend the money first refusal inside the country. Now, the Sweden did exactly the same thing. Now, Germany did it with the army armaments, construction projects like the Autobahn. Sweden did it on roads and hospitals and schools. And that is paid off dividends now because they've got some of the best school systems in the world and some of the best hospitals. And road infrastructure, which is time-consuming, a lot heavy on raw materials, and employs a lot of people. So you've got a lot greater ripple effect on the wider economy. So it's just about, spend it on schools sounds great, and it's a political win. But realistically, once you built the school, it's not that much of a wealth creator ongoing.
It doesn't boost the national economy.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add another example, not in recovery from the Great Depression, but another case study for supply side spending and investment in infrastructure, which is what we're talking about in the context of broadband, because broadband, is now considered as important a piece of infrastructure as roads or the electricity grid or whatever, is South Korea. So South Korea itself, the whole of Korea, was a fairly underdeveloped country until the Korean War. It obviously wasn't improved immediately by the Korean War. But then after the Korean War, the Americans especially just chucked money at South Korea. And it looks like they spent it wisely, because they are famously, getting back to broadband, they are famously probably the single best country for telecommunications, if we include fixed and mobile. And that's because of a hell of a lot of upfront spending on what was initially presumably a copper network. So yes, there's an example of where it's done well. I agree with you, Jamie. The multiplier effect will kick in and good things will happen. So it's not accurate to rubbish the multiplier effect, but it is accurate to say it often doesn't kick in because of bad priorities or bad implementation.
Yeah, it's bad policy making, and this is why I think that that you should be. I'm going to say this: we should be prioritising broadband and 5G sort of infrastructure, because I'm a telco and tech journalist. But if you actually have a look at the multiplier effect, especially with the 5G economy, I mean, what happened in 4G was the countries that were first to scale created companies that had a huge mass market adoption of 4G that they could test and fine tune ideas. They got cash momentum in their own business, which created a strong domestic business for them to catapult into the international market. Now, that is the value of having a scaled nationwide 4G network. And you look at I get that some people turn around and go, "Oh, that's just that's just nonsense. It's just economics theory." No, it's not. I mean, Netflix, Uber, Airbnb, Microsoft, Google. These are all companies which which existed, but accelerated their developments in the mobile world and exported their services, killing off localized competition because they were the better product. Now, if you can scale a 5G network quicker, you get a mass market adoption, which is a test bed for British companies, let's say, to trial 5G specific services on their audience before people in France or innovators in Germany. Then you've got a more advanced product which you can export to Germany and win through fair competition. And then all of a sudden, when the next Uber emerges, where are all the profits going to be redirected? I mean, look at the 4G economy. I mean, Silicon Valley is just a sponge. It's a wealth creation zone. And, there's going to be new wealth creation zones and clusters around the world, but they're not going to be evenly distributed. And the 5G wealth is not going to be evenly distributed. So you have to dominate that from the early years and suck all the R&D, innovation, and external investments back into your economy.
Well, I think Silicon Valley's done too well because I'm not going to get onto it now, but increasingly places like the UK and elsewhere are looking to clip their wings a little bit because they're a bit monopolistic when it comes to digital advertising. Ian, we haven't let you get a word in edgeways on the subject of broadband investment and sort of supply side spending and all that jazz. Got any thoughts on the matter?
Yeah, I mean, I on the one hand, I think it's depressing that there wasn't mention of broadband in the Johnson speech, as Jamie's saying, and especially after he made this big deal, a couple of years ago with that newspaper article, I think, about having, gigabit everywhere by 2025. I think it depends how it's done. That's the thing. You look at previous efforts to pump huge amounts of money into the broadband sector or to sort of nationalise it, and you see what happened in Australia with the National Broadband Network, and very few people have got positive things to say about that. And then I suppose they'd look at there's an argument maybe that they'd look at the telecom sector at the moment and feel that it's pretty resilient in the crisis. They're doing, telecom companies are doing quite well. You've got BT investing in fibre. I think it's recently increased its targets to have 20 million homes covered by 2025, or is only 15 million before. You've got a more vibrant market now with companies like City Fibre. So maybe they feel that the work's already being done by the private sector. And I don't know, I think there's a very strong argument for doing maybe other things in terms of fomenting broadband investment. I think it was a paper actually that Vodafone put out this week about how much the 5G could contribute to the economy, and there wasn't a call for government funding there. There was a call for the government to do other things, which I think have been a real problem for broadband for years. Things to do with planning permits and landlords being able to make a fuss about changes that get made, which can hold projects up for ages. I mean, Jamie and I have both been at press conferences where we've heard Scott Petty, the Vodafone UK CTO, grumbling about restrictions on mast heights. There's all sorts of regulatory niggles that could be done, I think, to make a big difference to broadband investment. And this gets right to the sort of whole Openreach discussion about what kind of entity Openreach is and how fairly other companies can access that. And small changes that we've seen happen, I think, over the last few years have had a real impact in terms of bringing companies like City Fibre in, which is now backed by Goldman Sachs, let's remember, and it's pumping quite a lot of money in, we're being told. So I'm not, I don't know. I think in a way it's depressing, to not have some kind of investment there. I just worry about how it gets done, because I think governments, suggestion before the election about nationalisation of BT with that whole Labour manifesto, and everybody was pretty horrified by that. And we certainly, I don't think any of us now, us three, would want to see any kind of steps towards the nationalisation of telecom infrastructure in the UK. If it can sort of be dispersed to private companies somehow, maybe there's an argument for that. I mean, it's exceptional circumstances, so normally I'd not be a fan of that kind of thing, but this is almost like a rebuilding after a war. So the whole Keynesian argument about it, I think, does have some merit.
Well, the thing is, I get where you're coming from, that, there is money in the industry, and, you don't want to muddy the waters with government involvement too much. But, I mean, I don't think anyone in the industry will complain about more money being thrown at broadband networks.
Well, it depends where it gets thrown.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, if
they don't want it thrown at BT, do they? That's the issue.
No. Yeah, they don't want it thrown at BT, but I mean, realistically, you've got to upgrade the BT network. I know that Virgin considers itself an alternative to BT, but let's be honest, it's not. Or it is if you're very lucky to be in that footprint. And I know that City Fibre considers it to be somewhat of a wholesale alternative to BT, but let's be honest, it's not, unless you're in the right postcode. Throwing money at and asking and being reliant on OpenReach is something that, we just have to do. There's no way around it. So yeah, I mean, it's. But I agree that I do agree that you don't want the government muddying the waters too much, because they have a habit of ruining things. The other interesting sort of story which came out this week was the announcement from the European Commission about the new rules which would make small cell deployment, except in some exceptional circumstances, exempt from planning permission. Now, interestingly enough, the UK has said that it will follow these proposals. There is a consultation. They're not too sure how they're going to implement these rules in the localized nuanced way, but by December 2020, there should be new rules to say small cell will not require planning permission, which hopefully will address one of the big issues.
Yeah, I think I'm going to just comment on that and then move it along because we're running out of time. One of the things Bojo said, so his spending pledge is tiny compared to the US. Even if you account for it as a proportion of GDP, it's like 5 billion as opposed to 10 zillion in the US. But other stuff he said was along the lines of changing the way government works and cutting bureaucracy and that sort of thing. And I was more enthused by them, but then I would be as a bit of a right-wing small government kind of guy. But, there is more to changing the economic circumstances of a country than just chucking public money at stuff. And if, and Jamie's small cell example is one, if sometimes government and the state would just get out of everyone's way and just let them get on with stuff, that's often the best way. But, that's where you get into real philosophical, political divides as to size of government and all that sort of thing. And maybe if we're eventually allowed to meet in the pub, guys, we can litigate the hell out of that one over a few beers. Okay. So we only got about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to move it on to the last one, which is this thing that we touched on last week. It was sort of my pet topic last week, but I was gratified to see, Ian, that you've been writing about it in Light Reading as well, which is basically this ad boycott, which started as what seemed to be quite a political campaign to me, but has then metastasized into this broader sort of corporate running scared of social media in general thing. Now, there's stated reasons mainly for running scared is the political atmosphere in the States. So it's pretty mental at the best of times on social media in the States, Twitter, etc. And anything to do with Donald Trump is obviously very incendiary. And we're about to have a general election in November where Donald Trump could win a second term, and a decent chunk of the company consider that to be a matter of sort of existential peril. I think that's slightly hysterical because I don't think Trump, whatever you think of him as a person, has done anything too spectacularly damaging in his time. But by saying that, I'm probably opening myself up. It's a good thing I'm not saying this on Twitter, let's put it that way. So they've just gone, do you know what? We're out. We're just not touching it. But then at the same time, there have been people putting increasing pressure on Facebook. And what I found interesting about that dynamic is that Facebook's actually resisted. at a time where corporates seem to be tripping over themselves to placate the mob at every possible opportunity, Facebook's actually gone to its advertisers, which are massive companies like Unilever and Coca-Cola and all that sort of thing, which probably spend billions a year on Facebook alone on advertising. It's just gone, no, we're not going to let you dictate our policies to us. There's probably a little bit more to it than that. But I was sort of gratified to see that. And I think maybe the advertisers, and I'll hand it on to you here, Ian, I think maybe the advertisers are slightly overplaying their hand and thinking that they hold all the cards when in fact they don't. What do you think, Ian?
Yeah, that was kind of my angle, actually. And I think a few other people have picked up on that as well. If you look at Facebook's numbers, they actually get most of their revenues. I think they've got about 8 million advertisers in total. And they have very little exposure to the real big sort of leaders. Most of their money comes from the kind of what we call the long tail, I guess, small and medium-sized companies that really, really need Facebook because of the audience it gives them. And there's a real kind of irony here. We're in a lockdown. People can't meet colleagues. They can't meet friends and mingle. So what are they doing? They're bundling into Facebook instead. We saw those stats that came out from companies like Nokia from its deep field stats, and Facebook itself, when it reported earlier in the year, I think its daily active users is up about 170 million in the first quarter compared with the year earlier period. So people are bundling into Facebook and advertisers are going the other way because of a small number of people on Facebook are saying some unpleasant things. Just sounds absolutely balmy to me. It really does, and yeah, all right. I mean, I suppose some of the people on Facebook, there are people who have concerns about it on the sort of privacy side. There was all that Cambridge Analytica scandal a few years ago, and I'm sure people are grumbling about it to some extent, but I kind of feel these advertisers in the long run will. I mean, look at the company share price is very interesting as well, actually, because there was a bit of a dip last week, which some of the papers made a big thing about on Friday. I think it went down about 8%. And when I looked earlier in the week, it recovered most of that and is still doing pretty well compared to its price this time last year. Whereas a company like Unilever, which is one of the big players to have actually pulled out of advertising, is down about 15%. And an ex-CEO is sitting there in an interview saying, Facebook's going to be in the graveyard of the dinosaurs unless they change their tune and do more on this kind of stuff. There's a bit of a disconnect to me in terms of what's going on. But I mean, who knows? I think the real danger for them maybe is what happens on the, if this sort of moves into a kind of regulatory sphere, and we start to get restrictions made on what they can do, and more supervision of hate speech and more kind of calls for them to take down posts that where they think there's a real sort of grey area and they don't see an argument for doing that. That's potentially the danger for them, I think, in terms of the position they've tried to take.
But the irony of the regulation of hate speech specifically is it would actually protect them from the advertisers. Now, I'm not a fan of the word hate speech because the hate is so ill-defined. Hate speech is
you put it in inverted commas usually.
I do. I do the scare quotes.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, I don't like it. Obviously, I'm not a fan of people being foul to each other. I'm not a fan of bigotry. I'm not a fan of discrimination along the lines of certain immutable characteristics such as sex, race, sexual preference, etc. No sensible person is. But hate speech always has this tendency to just morph into any speech that the person who's implementing the rules doesn't like. So that's why I use my scare quotes on that one. But ironically, if government said, right, Facebook, you have to censor this, this, and this, but nothing else, but you're not allowed to censor otherwise, then they're completely protected from advertisers because advertisers can flounce all they want and they just go, look, don't look at me, gov. I'm just following the rules. So there's that. But yes, I think we can. But I think you do make a good point about other forms of regulation. This is what came up with this CMA investigation in the UK. So Google apparently accounts for 90% of all search advertising in the UK. If that's not a monopoly, I don't know what is. Facebook apparently, this is digital, obviously. Facebook apparently accounts for over 50% of digital display advertising in the UK, which is, not quite a monopoly, but I think under certain definitions of a monopoly it is if you own more than half the market. So that stuff needs to be addressed, and I don't think anyone's suggesting that they arrived at those ridiculous market shares through any illegal activity. But it doesn't matter. Once you're a monopoly, you're a monopoly, however you got there. And it's in the public interest to at least monitor, if not curtail, the power of those monopolies. So I agree with you. That's a bigger threat. But, in conclusion on the Yeah, go on. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I mean, it's because it's sort of snowballed, hasn't it, in the last few days in terms of the big people who've pulled out. There are quite a significant number now. I mean, I still think you still look at what the analysts are saying, and they're quite upbeat, I think, on Facebook's prospects from a business perspective, because most of its revenue does come from this many millions of small and medium-sized enterprises. But the large corporations have really sort of raced to join the kind of criticism. And I don't know. I mean, there just seems to be a huge amount of virtue signaling, which I guess comes from that you look at Facebook as maybe, I don't know what the old-fashioned equivalent is. I mean, you've talked about it like a town square or something, but in a way, that platform has replaced a lot of the newspapers and what they used to do. And we never saw advertisers, respectable advertisers, complaining about some of the weird posts you get in classified columns in newspapers, or the fact that there's a big pair of tits on page 3 or whatever it is. And there's content in there that's potentially dubious, but you don't hear them sort of making the same kind of fuss about them having an advert on the back page, where it's not that far from one of those.
Although, having said that, to the best of my knowledge, I don't buy the Sun, but said displays no longer occur in the Sun. So maybe that was advertiser pressure. Who knows?
It's a concealed pair of tits, isn't it now?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, who knows? I mean, but I think you're touching on a really important point that should affect both media and social media. And I think this is why Mark Zuckerberg and the Facebook leaders are right to push back. As soon as you start letting your commercial partners hold you to ransom, where does it stop? So much mainstream media, and even, it could be said, trade media, have allowed themselves to put the cart before the horse and write what they think is going to please commercial partners. That is not the way you should do it, because what commercial partners actually want is an audience. They don't want complimentary, placating editorial. I mean, some people in marketing departments might say they want it, but what they ultimately will give you money for is
the audience.
Just having a large audience.
It's out of sync with the trend. As I say, the audience stats look really good. More and more people. It's like people are going to grumble about it in the same way that, guys sit and read the Sun newspaper and they go, oh, they print all sorts of rubbish in the newspapers, don't they? And then they all go down to the cafe and read it, and this is perhaps a bit out of date nowadays, because I think the circulation for all the papers has been dwindling. But the same thing happens with Facebook. People probably moan about privacy stuff and the fact that this is going on, but they've got more users than ever. And the vast majority of those people are using it for the sort of stuff that we're doing now. And advertisers are kicking up a stink about a minority of, let's use the inverted commas thing again, hate speech or whatever you want to call it.
But I mean, both Light Reading and Telecoms.com will write stories that are awkward to people who advertise with us. But they understand and they advertise because they get something out of it. By the way, I have to apologise. If anyone heard the opening chords of Voodoo Child by Jimi Hendrix, then that's my phone ringtone, which suddenly went off. I thought I had it on
I could
mute.
Hear something.
Yeah,
couldn't tell what it was.
That was my phone. That's what I use. So listen, we're going to wrap it up. We haven't asked Jamie whether he's got any views on this particular sort of advertiser boycott and all that sort of thing. So Jamie, before I wrap it up, do you have any thoughts on the matter?
No, not really. I saw that, when you actually have a look at whose boycott is, and this might have changed over the last couple of days, but even with all the big names, it's only like 6 out of the top 25 advertisers for Facebook which have actually cut ties. So, combine the biggest advertisers on one side with the long tail, and you probably assume it's not going to have that much of an impact on Facebook numbers. And also, this sort of thing is going to pass in 6 months' time. Facebook won't be talking about this in their AGM next year. The virtue signal would have passed, and it'll be business as usual.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And furthermore, while this thing will pass, a new thing might come up, and Facebook has now drawn a line in the sand and said, "Look, I don't care what you're moaning about. It's not for us to curate the stuff on our site too closely." Anyway, okay, I think we've done an hour and Ian's got stuff to do. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Thanks again, guys. Maybe see you face to face next week. Let's see. And thank you for listening, and make sure you join us for that one.